Do you feel like you're in a race? Do you feel like this whole life is just some sort of a race? I know in scripture several times it's compared to a race, but I don't think we're in it alone. I think it's more of a relay than just a marathon. It is more of a marathon than a sprint, but a relay in a sense that there are people to help. We're not in this alone. When you're in a relay, there's a part of the race when you are absolutely running alone, but you're going to pass that baton off. There's a point, if you're not the first one, that you're going to accept that baton from someone. I was listening recently to Christine Kane, and in her lesson that she was talking about this, it was so encouraging. It was so enthusiastic to think that, you know what, we are in a relay. We're not just in a marathon by ourselves. In 2004, she was speaking of the women in the Olympics and how that they had dropped the baton. They were favored to win the race. And if you look at a lot of the information on it, even the coach says, you know, this is the hardest part of a relay is getting the baton. It's not running. You could be the fastest team out there, but if you cannot get the baton, if you don't have the exchange down, then you'll lose. In 2008, the same thing happened. They did not qualify. The men also did not qualify. This was the first time the men had not qualified for the Olympics since 1912. 96 years. Tyson Gay, he was supposed to receive the baton, and he said, I'll take all the blame for it. I felt it for just a second, and then I closed my hand and it wasn't there. And he said, I will take all the blame. But Patton, who was doing the exchange, who was passing the baton, he said this. He said, I know it's my job to get the guy the baton, and I didn't do that. He said, listen, it's my job to get the guy the baton, and I didn't do that. And he said, I'll take the blame. They both took the blame. Listen, in a relay, we're in this together. Everybody has to do their part. There are so many people out there that are expecting to get the baton without ever doing any work. They may not train for the race. They may not train for the hours and hours and hours it takes to receive the baton, but they still want it. But I also see the other extreme of this, that there are a lot of people that do not want to give it up. There are people that are saying, you know what, I want to hold on to this as long as I can. I do not want to pass it on. On this YouTube channel, that's one thing I want to do is help to pass the baton. We're in a race together. And I hope that just something I say might help encourage faith or encourage some knowledge, to help answer some questions. And someone out there that's searching, I want to help pass the baton. In Hebrews chapter 12, we see the story of a race. This, of course, is right on the heels of Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, actually last week I was studying Hebrews chapter 11, had done a video on what is faith. And my mind is kind of fresh on that, but you see Abraham, you see Noah, you see Abel, you see Enoch, you see all these people and their story of faith and what they had, how they had received this faith. Faith, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. They had heard stories. They knew that God was with them. They knew that God was sovereign. So they had this faith because of some evidence in their lives. As you get to the end of chapter 11, it starts talking, it says, I mean, just think of what these people went to. It says in verse 34, it says they were quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty. And then it gets on to verse 35. Women received back their dead by resurrection. But then look at what happened to them because of their faith, because of what they were doing for the cause of God. It says, others suffered mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though committed through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us. But apart from us, they should not be made perfect. So chapter 11 ends up talking about some of the horrible things that these fathers of the faith had to go through, but they stuck to it because of their faith, because they knew that God had parted the Red Sea. They knew that God had had parted the Jordan River, how he had led their people out of bondage in Egypt, how he had done this, how he had done that. They had heard story after story, and they knew that God was able, and they said, we will stick with him no matter what. And they lost their lives, a lot of them, for it. So when it gets to chapter 12, this is how it starts. It says, therefore, referring to what we just talked about, this cloud of faith people, these people that had had the faith, that had lived it, had exemplified it. Because of this, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Just picking out a few things in this verse, it says we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. This is referring to these people in the faith chapter that we just talked about briefly. You have time, look at chapter 11 at some point, and you could read through there and see what some of these people, it's talked about what they had done, their faith that they had for the cause of Jesus Christ. It says we're surrounded by this cloud of witnesses. It's almost as like, you could almost even picture that these people who have gone on before us are sitting watching. And it says, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which clings so closely. There's a difference between a sin and a weight. Of course, we all have in our mind what sin is, and we could hear about the 10 Commandments. You shouldn't, thou shalt not murder, shall not steal, shall not commit adultery, on and on. We should. Everybody has ingrained within them that some of these things are wrong, that these things are wrong, that you shouldn't do it. If not to be angry at your brother without a cause, as Jesus put it. We've all done some of these things. We've all had sin. We have sin in our life. We're not perfect. We won't be until we get to heaven. But it's not just the sin, it's the weight. Every weight we have to lay aside. If we're going to run a race, and if we're going to run it as if we're going to win it, and this is the reason it's important, it's because it's not just about me. I'm not just running a marathon by myself. I'm running a relay. Thank God for those who passed me to Baton. There's been a lot also that I have tried to learn from and didn't want to give a baton up. They didn't want to pass anything on at all. But thank God for those that have. I want to be faithful running this race to help pass the baton. I want to be there to answer the questions that they may have. As Peter talks about, to be ready to give an answer to everyone that asketh you of the hope that lieth in you. Do you have hope? If you do, you should be ready to give an answer. You should be ready to walk that life of faith with them, to say, come along with me. I want to live life with you. I want you to see the faith so that you will be able to live it. I want you to know what it means to have the faith of Jesus Christ. But we have to lay aside every weight. If you're going to run a race, you don't want to put a weight vest on. You don't want all these things encumbering about you in order to run this race. And the weights are different for you than what they are for me. Just putting down social media is probably putting down a weight. To think of how terribly it just comes on you time after time. As long as you're just scrolling through, and I say this about myself, if you're scrolling through Facebook and looking at the feeds, it just becomes a weight. And before you know it, you've spent or wasted an hour. I love keeping up with it. I love keeping up with what's going on in the news, but don't let it be a weight. C.S. Lewis said this is not an exact quote, but he said, Christianity, if it's true, is of utmost importance. If it's false, it's of no importance. But the one thing it cannot be is moderately important. I look around us today. Of course, my viewpoint basically is obviously the United States of America is where I live. But I look around and I see so many nominal Christians, so many people who just let the weights on them and they, have a basic understanding of faith. So many people will tell you that they're a Christian, but they have not taken the time to really get into the Word, to actually take time to pray and say, and just speak to God through Jesus Christ. Just nominal Christians. They don't even know what they believe. And that is so prevalent in our world today. We have to lay aside the weights if we're going to run this race and run it correctly, whatever your weight may be. It may be a sport. It may be a car. It may be some sort of a hobby. Listen, there's nothing wrong with any of those things. But don't let it be such a weight that your race is hindered, that you're not able to pass the baton. I read a quote just recently by Josh McDowell, or Sean McDowell, I believe it was, and said that that's one of the biggest fears of parents that he has found, is that they are afraid they will not pass their faith on to the next generation. I see questions all the time. I just read one from a friend in the last month on Facebook saying he would love to see what's going on in college, why so many kids are losing their faith in college. I think a lot of it's our fault because we're not passing the faith on to that generation that's going to college. We're not teaching them correctly. We tell them, yeah, you're an American. We tell them, yeah, you're a Christian. We may lead them to church once a week or once every other week. But are we really passing the baton on to them? Are we spending the time teaching them, dealing with them, training them for a world that they are going to go out to, that they have to know how to handle it? It's not isolation, it's inoculation. We have to get them out into the world to an extent to teach them. They have to know what's coming so that when they go to a secular college or when they go to a secular job, they will have the answers. They will have the faith within them to know that they can withstand. And we have to lay aside our weight so that we are willing and ready and able to pass on that faith to the generation that's coming. And it's not even to that generation. It's mostly to them, but it's even my generation. There's people even a generation ahead of me that still have questions, that still don't understand it. We still need to be able to cast aside our weights, not because of us. That's such a selfish thing to think we're doing this or that for us. You know, it's not about works. We think so often, well, I'm going to do all this and that'll help me at some point. It's not about that. It's about running a relay and passing on the baton. So we see that every weight and the sin which clings so closely to us, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Listen, this race is going to continue to go on and on and on. It's going to just go until we're taken home. I don't know when Jesus will return. Nobody does. The only thing we can do is stay active and stay busy and occupy till he comes. We have to run the race with endurance. We have to just continue as if this is our last day. And the reason we're doing it is to pass it on. It's not once you pass, it's not final. I'm talking about every day. You're passing that thing to somebody. You're passing the baton on. We are running with endurance the race, and it says the race that is set before us. My race is a little different than yours. My race is actually so different now than it was 2 years ago. This is not the race that I was expecting now that I'm on. But I believe with the things that are going on in the world today, with COVID-19, with riots, with all these things, listen, we have got to understand that God is shaking us up, that he is sovereign, that he has destined all these things that are going on. And maybe he doesn't like exactly what's going on in the church. Maybe that's why when Jesus overturned the tables, maybe God is doing that now so that we will see it's not about the stage. It's not about the lights. It's about passing on our faith, a faith that needs to withstand if we're not allowed to go to church, if we're not allowed to do these things. Our faith has to be able to withstand. And when we're on our way to church out of a sense of duty, we need to realize that our real ministry, we're passing as we go there. There are thousands of homeless people all across the country, and our church buildings sit empty almost all week except for 2 hours a week. We could be housing the hungry. We could be housing the poor and the homeless in our church buildings. But we are missing our real ministry, worried about the 2 hours a week when we're standing on a stage, when someone is actually putting forth, to try to encourage. I'm not against that. I'm not against church. I love to go. I miss it. I miss what it used to be to some extent. But God, I believe, is shaking us up, and it's time to understand it. We have got to pass on our faith, whether it's out at the park or whether it's at the job site, or whether it's running down the trail, jogging down the trail, we got to be passing on our faith. We got to be always ready to give an answer. We have to live that life that someone, showed them that Jesus loves them. That's our ministry that we pass every day. It's the people that surround us. It's the race that is set before us. That is our ministry. It's our race. It's what we're running. And so then it goes on to say, it says, listen, not only is it the race that says before, it says it's looking to Jesus. So we don't look back at this crowd of people of faith that it talked about in chapter 11. We don't look back at grandma and grandpa in our lives and say, oh, I want to be like them. No, it's great that we had that baton passed to us by a previous generation, but we look to Jesus. And this is why. I mean, he was the founder and the perfecter of our faith. He said, who for the joy to set before him, he endured the cross. There would be no salvation apart from one who was perfect, who said, I will die for you. He was the one who came. He's the one that, although he knew the cross was there, he looked at his Father and said, Father, if it be possible, please take this cup from me. But he couldn't take it from him. And Jesus had to give his life for you and for me. And we are to look to him. We're not to look to others. We look to him when we're passing on this, as we go and as we're passing on this baton to someone else, to another generation. Understand that it's not about saying, I have run this much. It's about saying, Jesus did this for me. It's about passing it on for him, for the cause of Christ. There's a story in 1 Kings chapter 19, a very familiar story, and we see Elijah there. Oftentimes, in the church world, we hear about passing on the mantle. I kind of like passing on the baton because a lot of people that I'm trying to reach that I hope will at some point listen to this video, they may not have heard the Christianese about passing on the mantle. But Elijah had a mantle. It was basically a cloak that was on him, and he was going to pass it on to Elisha. Before all that happened, this is what happened. In 1 Kings chapter 18, you see Elijah, and he literally calls down fire from heaven that, consumes the prophets of Baal, that licks up all the water that was around the altar there. But by chapter 19, he is discouraged. And he said, God, I'm all alone. There's nobody else with me. And as you get to chapter 19 here, I probably won't take time, but as you get down to verse number 19, it says, and of course this is Elisha. Now consider this. Elijah, they had the school of the prophets. He had been around other prophets. He's serving basically in Israel, the northern part of the 10 northern tribes. Elijah and Elisha were to them. They were already in captivity. They were prophets to these people who were in captivity to Assyria. And here Elijah, he had all these different prophets around him. And God had told him, said, I have reserved 7,000 people who have not bowed. But this is who he found. It said, so Elijah, he departed, and he said, from there he found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen in front of him. And he was with the 12. They said, and Elijah passed by him and cast his cloak upon him. You know, if you're a pastor, if you're a servant, if you're a teacher, or if you're just a student of God and you say, I don't know who I'm supposed to pass the baton to, there's nobody that wants it. This seems to be a thing that we hear often, is that, well, this generation coming up, they don't understand, they don't get it. Well, maybe I am not doing what I should do. Maybe I'm not going and looking for them where they need to be. Maybe they're not necessarily just sitting in your Sunday school class. Maybe you need to go out where they're working and see them plowing with their yoke of oxen and just go by and say, here, I'm going to, as Elijah put the mantle on him, and I saying it this way, I'm going to hand you the baton. This is a race that I want you to run. And that encouragement, that living life with him, Elisha lived life with Elijah until Elijah was taken up, and Elisha got the mantle from him at that time and carried it on. We have a job. If you're a believer already, then you have a job to pass the baton on, encouraging someone else. If you see in them that they may make a good teacher, encourage them to teach. If you see in them that they make, a good servant at serving the hungry, then you help encourage them and say, this is what we're going to do. Let's go buy lunch for this family, for this person. Let's do this. And if you're just in a point where you're questioning and wondering, how am I going to run this race, then just understand to get in the Word of God, to pray and go look for someone who can help pass you the baton, to just get into service. It's great and even important to be around other Christian people where we can worship together, where we can go to church, where we can learn. But that is not the ministry. The ministry is out there. It's going out. And as James wrote, to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction. He said this was pure religion and it's undefiled. We have so much to do to pass the baton. And that's what I so want to do. Whether this video is watched by 5 people or 500 people, I don't know. But I know this. I know God put upon my heart to start teaching and sitting in front of a camera, which is one of the hardest things that I've ever done. But it's about passing the baton. It's about those people who have questions, and maybe they will just find us in a search and say, this has helped me. I don't know whether it'll ever help anybody. But I know at this point in my life, in this ministry, this is the race that God has set before me. And this is what I'm going to do. Until next time, run the race and pass the baton.